Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
This is very interesting, I think, chapter, because it says a lot about Peter. It's the closing of this little letter. He gets a little more personal. He's going to tell us a little about himself. I think we can pick up in some of Peter's lifestyle, what happened to him as he walked with Christ, as we look at this. Vernon read it to you in New American Standard, and I want to go back through now in Williams, and hopefully you have a different translation than that you have to find the words I'm talking about and find out where they are and where they fit. Now, when it begins, so as a joint elder with them. Now, Vernon started out, put that a little bit later. This is the only place in all the New Testament this word appears. It's the word for elder, presbyteros, with a compound on the front, soon, which means together with or joint participation in. And so what Peter is saying of himself is not that he feels like that he's above the other elders, but he is making himself one of the elders together with them. Now this is a unique word. He must have coined it. It's the only place it ever appears. As a joint elder or joint participator in eldership, we might want to put, with them, a witness of the sufferings borne by Christ. Peter's saying, now, I'm a joint elder with you, but instead of saying an apostle of Jesus Christ the way he begins this letter, he alludes to that when he says an eyewitness of the suffering of Christ. What he's saying is, I walked with Jesus. I was there. I saw it. So he's a joint elder, but he's a joint elder with special knowledge. And so he's saying, listen up, I'm one with you, but I walked with the Lord, and I want to share some of that with you. Now the word elder, the New Testament is very hard to pin down the names of the early church leaders. There's several names used in the New Testament for the leaders. There's the word elder, it's the word presbyteroi, we get the word Presbyterian from it. There's the word episkopos. We get the word, of course, Episcopalian from it. It means bishops or overseers. And then very seldom the word pastor is used. Now, it's hard to know. It seems like that Paul, though he said point elders in every place, never calls those local pastors elders. And why the names are so fluid, we don't know. The place that gives me the key that the word elder and the word bishop are synonymous is Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, where both names are used in the same paragraph for the same person. So that's why I think the term elder and bishop or overseer are synonymous terms for the leadership of the early church. We're going to see that in just a minute, that all three names are used in this first few verses. Now it says, a sharer of the glory that is to be uncovered. Now Peter makes another allusion to that in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. He talks about this again. Now I think what he's talking about, if you had to think, where did Peter really see the glory of Christ in Jesus' lifetime, where would it be? Transfiguration. Jesus began to glow. God spoke out of a cloud. Man, I want to tell you, Peter saw the glory of Christ before the resurrection. And I think he's alluding to it here. I think this passage in 2 Peter 1, 16 and 17 tells me, he's saying, man, I want to tell you, I was there. I saw it. You can't believe what happened. You know, and on and on. Now, notice where it says, I beg the elders among you. Notice, it is plural. It is plural. It is also plural, the word down here in verse 3 that says, proving yourselves models to the flock, plural. In Acts chapter 20, verse 17, Paul says goodbye to the Ephesian elders. The early church, there was only one church in every town, and there was a multiplicity of pastors. And you say, well, how can there be more than one pastor? Well, we have more than one pastor at this church, you know that? Don't we? Yeah. You see, in our day and time, we have split up the staff of churches into people with different titles. We call them minister of music and minister of outreach and associate pastors and all kinds of things. What they are is pastors. They have a separate responsibility, an area of ministry they're gifted in. That's what I think this is talking about. Now, there probably had to be somebody that was in charge of the whole thing, but I think it's beautiful to talk about the Ephesian pastors, the pastors of the church here. Helps me realize this is not a one-man show. This is a burden of ministry on the shoulders of many gifted people. And really, if you want to know the truth, the distinction between clergy and laity in the New Testament is only one of function. If the truth were known, these men were not paid. They did it on a voluntary basis part-time. And there was probably very little distinction between the elders and the deacons and those mature people in the flock who ministered. It was a ministering community with some guidance and leadership from some. And I like that concept very much. We are all ministers. Now, notice where it mentions here, as shepherds of the flock of God that is among you. Now, some translations add the little phrase, exercising oversight. As shepherds, exercising oversight. Does King James have that? Something like that. Does another translation here have it? NIV has, what does it have, Mark? Read it to me. Okay, NIV, New International Version. That's a pretty good manuscript variation. We don't know if it's original or not. But you see what's happening? We got the three terms for pastor. Exercising oversight is the verbal form of the word episkopos. Okay? Shepherding is a word that means to feed. It's a word for tend the flock of God. But by tending it means lead, guide, guard, protect, provide. It's a word that speaks of all the things a shepherd did for the sheep. So we have all those three terms for pastor used right here, one of the few places in all the Bible that happens. Now, where did this idea, first of all, where did the idea of elders come from? Is that something that the new church begun? And the idea of shepherd, is that something the new church begun? Is it a new term they coined? No. Where is the first place that the word elder appears in your memory in the Old Testament? Think back through. What account do you remember where the elders appear for the first time? Anybody? Remember Moses was trying to do all the administrative things, and Jethro, the father-in-law, said, "You're going to kill yourself, fella. Why don't you appoint some elders and let them take care of these minor things, and anything's real big, let them come to you." Numbers chapter 21, Numbers 11, 16 through 30. Numbers 11, 16 through 30 is the beginning of the idea of elders as administrative under-shepherds of the flock of God. Now, it doesn't stop there. Remember in the New Testament, several times when it's talking about the Sanhedrin, if it's giving the full designation, it lists, remember what it says? The high priest, who else? Scribes, and who else? Elders. So elders were usually the older people in the community that were civic leaders that in Jerusalem became part of the Supreme Court of the Jews, the Sanhedrin, but in every town there was a group like that for that town. So even in Jesus' day, the elders was a common designation for the leadership of a town. There were elders in the synagogue that took care not of preaching, but of making sure the air conditioner was on and, that kind of thing. Now, where does the word shepherd come from? Well, of course, you know Psalms 23. The Lord is my shepherd. It's not the only one. Psalms 100, verse 3, talks about the Lord is shepherd. It's a concept of God. And it comes from God through who? Through Jesus. That's why it's called here the arch shepherd down in verse 4. Arch shepherd, sheep shepherd. That's hard to say. Chief shepherd, first shepherd. The beauty of it is that God is the shepherd of His people. Jesus is divine. Therefore, in John 10, Jesus can say, "I am the good shepherd. No one who does not come through me enters the flock except thieves and robbers who climb over the fence. I'm the only door. I'm the good shepherd." Okay? He's putting Himself on par with the Old Testament description of Yahweh God. And now the word shepherding comes to be the leaders of the church. We would call them pastors today. That's what the word pastor means. But they are not shepherds. They are what? Under shepherds. There's only one shepherd of the church. That's Jesus. Everybody else is under shepherds at best. Now, We see here where it mentions he's going to give 4 words of wisdom to these elders, okay? And here they are. I think it's an important admonition to pastors, staff people, those feeling God is leading them that way. And it's not a half bad idea for all Christians. And here they are. Number 1, not as though you had to put of your own free will. Now, that's not saying that you've got to want to be a pastor. I think that's saying once you feel like God wants you to be a pastor, then you ought to do it freely, not grudgingly. Now, I want to tell you, most of the preachers I know didn't want to be preachers. God kind of tapped some of us on the shoulder and said, friend, you've just been drafted. And I didn't want to do that for nothing, I want to tell you. That wasn't something I desired anyway in the world. And so I don't feel this is talking about the initial response. I think it's saying once you feel like this is God's will for your life, then don't do it grudgingly or, all right, golly, I'll do it. Do it freely. Okay? Then the second one is, so do it freely without being made to. Second, from a motive of not from a motive of personal profit, but freely. Now, we know that the early church had a problem with false preachers, itinerant people who would come, preach, want a big love offering and move on, and what they preached was not true. Now we know that from the number of times that Paul was accused of preaching for money, and the number of times he talked to Titus and Timothy about it. Let me give you a couple of these. Titus chapter 1 verse 7 talks about that. 1 Timothy 3:8 talks about that. And here again in Peter it talks about that. There was a group of men who were out to make money in proclaiming the good news. Now remember, these early pastors were not paid a whole lot, if anything. So it wasn't bigger and better salaries they were looking for. It may have been mission offerings that they were defrauding, or maybe they were a local carpenter. And they would say to the church, now I'm your under shepherd and I think you ought to get all your chairs made at my joint. Maybe in that kind of thing. But there was a problem in the motives of the pastors of that day. Think there's a problem in the motives of pastors in our day? You haven't been to a pastor's conference lately. Number 3, not as domineering over those in your charge. Now, that's a very interesting little phrase. In the world, Jesus said, back in the Gospels, He said the Gentiles lorded over those to their control. The worldly way, if you have the power, use it. If you're in the driver's seat, drive. If you've got it, flaunt it. That's the world's way of authority. But the church is exactly opposite from that. The very fact that we have authority should make us more submissive, not more prideful. Now think with me. Not domineering it or lording it over those in your charge. Man's tendency, humanly speaking, is to dominate others. Jesus, the perfect example of authority, had all authority in heaven and earth, laid down His life freely and for others. Authority is something to be used in a specific way. Not how different that is from the world. Now, notice where it mentions here, and those in your charge. Now look at your translation in the middle of verse 3. Give me some other translations of that. Somebody else. Mark, what does NIV have? Entrusted, those entrusted to you. Okay, what does some other words have? Phil, did you bring your King James? What does it say? Yeah. God's heritage. Okay. Good translation. Okay, now that's the next phrase, the one right before that. What does that one have? It doesn't say over who? Okay, thank you, Denise. Somebody else have a different translation there? Yes, Marvin? Allotted. Now what translation's that? Okay, that's a good one, because that's the word. It's the word that means a lot. A lot meaning something that you, like when they got the promised land, how did Joshua divide it up? By lot. How did they cast, who got the garments at Jesus' crucifixion, the soldier? They threw lots for it. Now it's saying those whose charge has been allotted to you or inherited to you, that'd be a good translation. But this is also the word that we get the word clergy from. And so notice what, if you have a presupposition that wants the pastors to be in charge over other clergy, guess how you translate it? You see what's happening, of course. In a system where there are bishops and overseers, this verse is used and translated differently, and it doesn't come out in your charge. It comes out those clergy in your charge, or those pastors under you. And you see, it's used as a proof text to prove apostolic authority and on and on. But really the word means a lot, an inheritance, something that you got by chance, but it comes as an inheritance. Now, notice where it says, number 4, proving yourselves models for the flock to imitate. Now, notice the plural there. So here's the admonitions. Number 1, do it voluntarily, not greedily, not lording it, and be examples. Friends, I want to tell you, when you start hearing somebody preach the good news and then live another way, there's a major problem. The only way the good news is verified is when it's proclaimed and lived. It's very important that we live what we talk. I don't care how good you talk. If your life doesn't back it up, people are going to be turned away. Be examples in what you proclaim. It's not the right of power saying, now I'll tell you what to do, but I don't have to do it. It's the right of leadership in Jesus where He exemplified the things that He taught and said. Okay, those are the 4 admonitions to the elders. Now, notice where it mentions here, and when the chief shepherd, arch shepherd, appears, is clearly manifested, you will receive the glorious crown that never fades. It's talking about the what? Second coming. Second coming. It's talking about when Jesus comes again, the chief shepherd, the arch shepherd, the number 1 shepherd. When He comes again, if these kind of things characterize your ministry and your life, you'll receive the crown that's unfading. By the way, it's interesting to me, the word unfading comes from a flower. And this flower is an unusual kind of flower. I couldn't pronounce its name. It starts with an A. If there's any horticulturist here, maybe you all know what I'm talking about. It's M-A-R-A-S-S-A, something like that. When you cut it, it wilts. But if you put it in water, it revives. And it became, in the ancient world, a symbol of immortality because it seemed to never wither if you kept it in water, even though it was cut. And so that's the word here. It's used in chapter 1, verse 4 also. Now, the crown, I talked about this morning, that is an ancient symbol of winning something, a victory, a prize. And now we don't give that. Maybe a good cultural example for us would be you'll get the gold medal. An Olympic term for us might convey what this crown conveyed to them. It's a stanophos, not a royal crown, but a victory crown. A crown for hanging in there, a crown for finishing the race. Now, when it mentions in verse 5, you younger men on your part must be submissive to the elders. Now let's look at that. How many of you have the same word, elders, as you do in the previous verses, translated just alike? Does yours have be submissive to the elders, or does yours change the word and make it to the older men? How many have the same word? How many have a distinction made? New International, huh? I think there's a distinction made. I don't think we're talking about the leadership anymore. I think we're talking about older men. You say, well, where do you get that from? Well, in 1 Timothy 5:1, the same thing happens. 1 Timothy 3, we're talking about elders, qualification for church leaders, but that changes to older men. See, the word can mean 2 things. It can mean older men, or it can mean church leaders. And the context has to determine that. And so it's not like we have younger church leaders and older church leaders, I don't think. I think we've switched now from leaders, and we're talking about young people be submissive to the older people. Now look, let's go through it. You younger men, on your part, must be submissive. Aorist, passive, imperative. Completed action. You don't do it. It's done by an outside force. God allows us to be submissive to others. It's an imperative. It's a command. God commands us to do it. Younger men are to be submissive. Now, the word submissive is a military term that means to arrange oneself under, that speaks of a corporal to a sergeant, to a lieutenant, to a captain, to whatever. Okay? So it's an authority thing. Now, notice that's not something that's new. Notice it says to the elders, and you must all put on a servant's apron of humility. Now, this I did about my RSV interlinear had to one another. Now, that is the same thing that's mentioned in the universal principle that guides the Christian home that's mentioned in Ephesians 5:21. And be submissive one to another out of respect for Christ. Now, we have a relationship, every one of us. It should be determined not on the worth of the person we're relating to, but on the Lord that both of us know. Submissiveness is not something we earn. It's something we do because we're believers. We're submissive one to another out of respect, not for the person, but for Jesus Christ. Okay? And that shows to the world. The world's way is self-assertion, domineering, who's on top. The church's way is fighting to see who can be on the bottom. How different. Now, notice where it says, you must all put on the servant's apron. Now, you probably have a much different translation of that. Williams gets a bit interpretive, but correctly so. What do y'all have there? Y'all must tie up humility or something like that? Yes, Max? Clothe yourselves. Okay, does some of you have the word knot or tie around you? Yeah, Marilyn? Which one? Okay, that's very good. Wrap yourself with a garment. That's what it's talking about. It is an unusual, rare Greek word for putting something around you like a belt and tying a knot. Now, where in the life of Peter did someone tie something around themselves in connection with humility? You think it's an allusion in Peter's mind to that day when Jesus took off his outer garment and laid it down, and took the towel and girded himself, and poured water in a basin, and the Son of God began to wash the disciples' feet, who were still arguing over who's greatest? You think Peter, like he reflected back on the Transfiguration, is now reflecting back on the foot washing? It's such a rare Greek term about tying something around you, really a rare term, that I think is exactly what Peter is alluding to. So mine gets... Marilyn, what was your translation? That was excellent. New English is good. Mine has the servant's apron, which is the same idea. It is an aorist middle imperative. Now, if you have your sheet on Greek terms, it's important you to get it out. The one about submit yourself was an aorist passive imperative. This is an aorist middle imperative. We cannot submit to someone else unless God's Spirit allows us to do it. Now, because God's Spirit allows us to submit to one another, it's possible that we wrap the towel of humility around ourselves. The middle tense means you yourself take the towel and wrap it around you. God allows the submissiveness. We respond by taking the towel, wrapping it around. It's a beautiful picture. God enables us, but we must allow God to enable us. God has the power, but we have the alternative to let Him flow through us in power or not. And so it's both. It's an aorist passive. God does it once and for all, but we must allow Him to do it. Aorist middle, imperative. Both commands. Now, notice if you will, let's see. Okay? And there's going to be a quote here. Peter quotes loosely Psalms 3:34 when he says, because God opposes the haughty, but bestows His unmerited favor on the humble. The word here, opposes, means to set in array against, a military term for an army coming face to face with another army. What God's saying is, I have a settled opposition to proud people. I will fight against the haughty. I myself will be in array against them. Now, friends, the characteristic sin of man is pride. It's what caused Adam to fall. That's what caused Lucifer to fall. That's what caused Peter to deny the Lord. On and on. We have a problem with us. Self. And I think it's an allusion to that right here. Now, God opposes the haughty or the proud, but bestows His grace on the humble. Verse 6. Therefore humbly submit. Aorist, passive imperative again. Once and for all, allow God. That's the idea of letting you submit to God's strong hand. Now, you know, how you grew up determines a whole lot about how you view God. Some people really think that God is a gigantic bouncer. He's really a strong person, and you cross Him and He'll just smash you like a bug. You break one rule, and I'll hit you with my stick. Now, some people have a view of God like that. That He's just a strong man. He commands people to do things. My view of God is He has all power. But He has limited that power in His love and patience and kindness toward us. He knows that we are mere dust. He knows that we're sinful. And so He has allowed His power to come in ways that we can understand, and has given us the dignity and worth of responding to Him, not in His power, but in His what? In His humility. Jesus supremely shows God in an act of service and humility, and if you understand this term correctly, weakness. God has so brought Himself down where we can accept Him, not because He's the strong man of the universe, because He is the dying Savior on the cross for mankind. God wins people with love, not with power. So when it says the mighty hand of God, it's not speaking about the fist that smashes. It's speaking about the hand that accomplishes what God wants to accomplish. God can split the Red Sea. God can make the mountains level. God can do anything He wants to. And that strong hand is now the hand that provides our needs, protects us, is with us, wraps us around, pulls us to Himself, is that strong hand of God. And there ain't no stronger hand, is there? Nobody can pluck them out of my Father's hand. It's not the power of strength, but it is power. It's the power of love. Okay? The strong hand of God. So that at the proper time He may exalt you. Maybe not in this life, maybe in the next. Maybe in this life after all. And then he quotes Psalms 55:22. And it says, cast every worry you have upon Him, because He cares for you. The word cast is a word that means to commit to. Commit your worries to Him. He is in control. He does have all power, but He loves you. If you have an anxiety, allow Him to take that anxiety. I think that's one of the most beautiful verses. I want to give you a couple of the verses to think about looking up later. Matthew 6:25-34, Philippians 4:6 are beautiful parallels. Because He cares for you. That is the unbelievable good news of the gospel. You, insignificant, sinful you, of all the billions of people in the world that have lived and will live, you, God knows and loves. Knows your problems, knows your needs, knows your wants, knows your desires. Cares for you. Can you believe that? Can you really believe the eternal Creator God knows your name, cares for you, provides your needs, wants to act on your behalf, and loves you? Boy, when you finally let that good news come home, man, you'll walk on clouds. You'll walk through any circumstance with head lifted up. God really cares for you, rebellious and all. God cares for you. Cast your worries on Him. He can handle them. You can't. He can. Now, it moves on then to verse 8, which is a repeated emphasis in the book of Peter because of the persecution and problems. Two imperatives, two aorist imperatives. Be calm, be alert. Now, this is in the face of persecution and problem and pain and suffering and death and confiscation of property. Be calm. It's almost like fear not, isn't it? Be alert. Be calm, but be watchful. Don't go to sleep in this deal, but keep you cool. Now, that's repeated, not in the same words, but the same kind of phrase in chapter 1, verse 13, and chapter 4, verse 7, the same admonition to these Christians. Be calm, be alert, be watchful, be sober. Now, When it says your opponent, the devil, is always prowling about like a roaring lion trying to devour you. The word opponent is a legal term for a lawsuit. Someone brings a lawsuit against you, trying to break you down or sue you or put you in prison. That's the idea here. Your legal adversary, the devil, diabolos. Dia, across, through, over, okay? And the other term means to throw, balo. Dia, balo, to throw across. So what is this picture of the devil? Someone who throws across. And what would he throw across our paths? An alternate route, an alternate way, a temptation toward self, a temptation toward doing it some other but God's way. It is one that brings another alternative into our life. Or, if you go back to the Hebrew concept of slanderer, it's someone who says a false thing, a lie, who brings a charge that's not true in. And here's the term here, diabolos, the devil. He's always prowling around like a roaring lion trying to devour you. When you finally see there is a supernatural force in our world, there is an invisible world coexistent with ours that is in turmoil. When you finally see that, and you realize that the purpose of the evil one is to destroy you, and all the works of God through you, you'll be watchful about things that happen. Friends, nothing just happens to God's children. Every circumstance of life is an opportunity to lift Jesus up or lift self up, and thereby the evil one. Every moment and opportunity is the crossroads of decision. The devil's out to destroy you. You know many who he has done that to. Be calm. He's a created being. He's not all-powerful. He can't force you to do anything. But for goodness sakes, be alert. Have your eyes open. Know what's happening. Ephesians 6:10 following talks about the full armor of God. But it's available for Christians, but the Christians must put it on. Smart up. Wise up. Friends, we are in a spiritual, supernatural battle for the lives and heart of men. Don't be dumb. Don't underestimate the adversary. Don't not recognize the spiritual opportunity or battle. Now, notice where it says in verse 9, resist him and be strong in faith. Reminds me of James chapter 4, verse 7. It's an aorist imperative. Withstand him. You can do it. You have the authority in Christ to resist temptation if you allow the Spirit to function in you. You do. Now, notice where it mentions, because you know that your brotherhood all over the world is experiencing the same sort of suffering. I haven't had somebody talk to me in a long time like this, but I do get it from time to time. You just don't know what I'm going through. You don't know how bad I got it. You don't know how bad I'm tempted. You don't know what happened to me. Well, no, I don't. I really don't. But aren't you glad I don't have to know for Jesus to make it all right? Friends, there's nothing really happened to you that's unique. You know, it's not that hot of cheese, really. It's happened before. It'll happen again, you know. Others have stood it. You can stand it. Jesus has been there. You can go through it because He's been there. You know, it's not that bad. Now, it may hurt and it may be terrible because you're in it. But it's happened to other Christians. It's happened before. It'll happen again. Jesus knows what you're going through, and He can handle it. He can handle it. Your brothers have experienced the same thing and come through it. You can too if you trust. I'm not saying it won't hurt, won't be painful. You can handle it. Now, verse 10. God, the giver of every spiritual blessing. You might want to see chapter 4, verse 10 there. Through your union with Christ, there's the key. Not our goodness. Everything we have spiritually has nothing to do with us. It has to do with our relationship to Jesus Christ, who He is, what He's done, what He's accomplished. Christ called you, election, to His eternal glory, to share in that. And then, let me see. After you have suffered a little while, you might want to see Romans 8, 28, 29. There's a purpose in your suffering. It's to make you more like Christ. Christ was perfected by the things that He suffered. I think it's Hebrews 5, 8. You probably will be too. Will Himself make you perfect, firm and strong. Now, I was looking at New American Standard. It has 4 terms. Vernon, yours has 4 different things there in verse 11. Does yours have 4 things? The last one is not in some manuscripts. Mine only has 3. You probably have 4. But listen what suffering does for a Christian. Listen good what suffering can do for a Christian. It can make you complete, equipped, firm, sure, make you strong, and lay a good foundation. Suffering does that. Suffering does all of that. Now, the word perfect has been the most misunderstood word, I guess, because of our English definitions and connotations. Perfect in the Bible never means without sin, without flaw, with no problem, because I ain't ever met anybody like that. Perfect in the New Testament here and most often is a translation of a Greek word that means fully equipped for the task that you're sent on. It means mature, fully equipped, ripe, ready. That's what it's talking about. Not flawless, not sinless, not without error, none of that. Firm and strong. I think that's a beautiful picture of what suffering can do if you let it. 1 Peter 4 dealt with suffering. Here's an admonition again of this church. He's saying, it'll equip you, it'll make you firm, it'll make you sure, it'll make you strong. Hang in there, church. Hang in there. Others are going through this. Hang in there. Verse 11. To Him be dominion forever. Boy, Peter couldn't stand it. He broke into a prayer before the letter got over. And then I think in verse 12, Peter took the pen from the secretary. I think the secretary is Silvanus there. By Silvanus, it's the Greek word dia, by means of or through. I think Silvanus is the one who wrote the letter for Peter. Many people have said it's too good a Greek for a fisherman. Now, I'll answer that question 2 ways. Number one, Peter is not your normal, dumb, ignorant fisherman. Peter was a middle-class, educated merchant. His daddy owned a fleet of ships. They made regular trips to Jerusalem to distribute those fish. That's how John knew those uppity-up people there. This was a blowing and going, productive operation. Peter wasn't a dummy. No. But number two, many have said Peter couldn't write this good a Greek. Silvanus could have. Silvanus was with Paul often. I think Acts 15:40 is one place. He's also called Silas. Now, he is a Roman citizen like Paul, but a Jew. And he seems to be a cultured. He's the one that Paul picked to go on the missionary team after him and Barnabas broke up. It's quite possible that the literary style between 1 Peter and 2 Peter is due to the fact that Silvanus had some leeway in writing down what Peter was dictating, and the Greek is very good, very polished. And 2 Peter is terrible Greek. Maybe Peter wrote it himself, I don't know. But Silvanus seems to have written this letter. By Silvanus, our faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written you this short letter to encourage you and to testify that this is the true, unmerited favor of God. Stand firm in it. Now, there's the admonition. He's still writing with his own hand, seems like. Your sister, now look real close to your translation. Your sister church in Babylon. That's what mine says. Now, Vernon's was much more accurate. She in Babylon. Didn't it say that? It is the feminine article. Now, some think it refers to, guess who? Peter's wife. Yeah. Peter took his wife with him when he went, right? It's quite possible it could refer to Peter's wife because then it mentions Mark, my son. There's the family allusion there. But I really think it's talking about the church. She's the bride of Christ. She's called feminine many times. And the church in Babylon. Now, Babylon is way over there where the Jews were exiled, thousands and thousands of miles away from where we think Peter ever was. By Peter's day, Babylon was pretty much deserted and a wreck. There's one other Babylon that we know from archaeological evidence, and that was a military outpost in Egypt by the Nile River, way out of the way. But the book of the Revelation uses the term Babylon for Rome. Now, it's not specifically Rome, but it's used for Rome in John's day. Let me give you the references. 14:8, 17:5, 18:2, and 10. The great whore Babylon is used in the book of the Revelation for any world power or world system apart from God. In John's day, it was Rome. In our day, I wonder what it would be. The church in Rome is what I think it means, though we can't be sure. Chosen along with you. And Mark, my son. Now, Papias, like Polycarp, a disciple of the Apostle John, says that Mark who wrote the Gospel, John Mark is what he's usually called, after Paul, he was with Paul a while, but he became attached to Peter. And that what we have in the Gospel of Mark is really the eyewitness recollections of the Apostle Peter. And so to read the Gospel of Mark is to read what happened through Peter's eyes. Now that fits with this as a text and what we know from history and the eyewitness account of the Gospel of Mark, because Mark wasn't there. Okay? Wish to be remembered by you. Notice Silvanus is not mentioned. Mark says goodbye, but Silvanus doesn't. Why? Probably he not only wrote the letter as far as taking down the dictation, but probably he's the bearer of the letter, and therefore he wouldn't send his greeting because he was going anyway. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Yeehaw! Why don't we do that? I believe the Bible. You ought to take it just like it says. Everything it says we ought to do. Why don't we kiss one another? Well, by the 4th century, the abuse had become rampant. How would you like to let your wife come to church and everybody kiss her? It's bad enough at the wedding, isn't it? Go home and spray her mouth with Lysol for you, you know. It got, and you know, the Bible mentions this a whole lot. Let me just give you some of the time, especially the Lord's Supper. They kissed a lot at the Lord's Supper. Romans 16:16, 1 Corinthians 16:20, 2 Corinthians 13:12, 1 Thessalonians 5:26. It's the most biblical thing in the world, a holy kiss. It is biblical. It is New Testament. But we don't do it anymore. It got out of hand. It was abused. It was taken advantage of. That which God gave in goodness, man perverted to evil, and the church let it go by the board. Now, friends, there's quite a few things like that. Now, by the 4th century, the church knew the perfect way to kill this. It wasn't say, don't do it anymore, because the church wouldn't listen, right? So the council in the 4th century said, all right, if you want to have a holy kiss, you can have a holy kiss. But men kiss men, and women kiss women, and that effectively killed it. The Russians still do that, don't they? Have you seen the Italians and the Russians greet one another that kiss you on the cheek? Well, I don't know what part of the anatomy they kissed, whether it was right on the lips or not, but the early church got abused. Remember their love feast? They were accused of being lascivious and all kinds of things anyway, and this just added to it. So they just kind of let it go by the board. So if you want to be biblical, you've got to have slaves and kiss one another. Peace to all of you that are in union with Christ. And there's the key. You can't have real peace till you know Him. And when you have Him, there's peace no matter what else there is or isn't.